When my husband turned our children into torture machines, I swore his experiment would have an unexpected end. Today, as he rots in an isolation cell, I tend to the flowers in my garden, knowing that his science found its definitive conclusion. Nobody messes with a mother and gets away with it. Good afternoon, my dear viewers. This is Edith May Gunderson, 78 years young, living in a small town in rural Montana. I was born in a simple cabin near Yellowstone, but it's here in this quiet corner of Big Sky country that I found my peace after weathering life's most terrible storm. Looking at me now, just a white-haired old lady tending to my herb garden and baking apple pies for the neighbors who visit on Sunday afternoons. You'd never imagine what these wrinkled hands have done. Folks around here know me as the herb grandma because I understand every medicinal plant in the region. I have a small garden behind my house where I grow a little bit of everything: lavender, chamomile, echinacea, and other herbs that only us country folk know by name. The young people in town always come here for natural remedies when they're feeling under the weather. My home is simple but cozy. A small wooden house painted light blue with white window frames that overlook the creek. I have a colorful rocking chair on the porch where I spend afternoons watching the wildlife come and go. I live alone, but I never feel lonely. My plants and my 3 cats, Patches, Rusty, and Willow, keep me company. And on Sundays, I receive visits from my grandchildren who drive in from Bozeman to see me. What nobody imagines is that behind this sweet grandma is a woman who once faced hell itself. Because, my dears, some people paid dearly for messing with me and those I loved when I was younger. Very dearly. As we say here in Montana, those who poke the bear get the claws. And believe me, some got more than their fair share of claws because of me. If you enjoy my story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Each like gives me more strength to continue sharing these stories that have stayed buried inside me for so long. And if you're watching this now, share it with a friend who you know has also been through tough times. And you, my friends who have faced difficult situations, comment below. Do you believe that sometimes you have to take justice into your own hands? Because you see, there are times when neither the police, nor man's justice, nor divine justice can handle the situation. There are times when we ourselves need to settle the score. Speaking of settling scores, get ready, because what I'm about to tell isn't a fairy tale. It's something that happened to me, with these eyes that will someday return to dust, with this body that has carried so much suffering. A story that begins with an innocent girl born on the banks of a Montana creek, but ends with a woman who discovered that even the most fragile being can become dangerous when cornered. Let's go back in time to when I was just a barefoot girl running along creek banks, never imagining that life was preparing me to become my own husband's guinea pig, a man who confused love with scientific experimentation. But before I continue, know one thing. At the end of this story, I wasn't the one who truly understood the meaning of pain. I was born in 1947, at a time when rural Montana was almost forgotten by the rest of America. My parents, George and Irene, were simple country folk who made their living from the land and forest. Daddy was a trapper and hunter who would leave before sunrise with his Winchester rifle and only return when the sky was full of stars. Mama took care of the house and sold natural remedies she prepared herself. It was from her that I learned everything about the healing plants of our region. Our house was at the end of a small settlement near Yellowstone. It was a wooden cabin built solid to withstand the harsh Montana winters. During spring thaws, the creek rose so high we could fish right from the kitchen window. When it receded, it left a muddy yard where we played hide and seek. We were 5 siblings. Me, the oldest, then came Johnny, Isaac, Sarah, and little David. Mornings began with rooster's crow, the rooster Mama raised in the coop next to the kitchen. I would wake up and fetch water from the creek in a bucket while Mama prepared cornmeal mush that we ate with dried venison. Afterwards, I helped look after my younger siblings while Mama ground herbs in the wooden mortar that Daddy had carved. Oh, how happy we were in our simplicity. On hot afternoons, we swam in the creek, trying to catch minnows with our bare hands. Sometimes, we'd go to the nearby forest to pick berries and nuts. Johnny, my brother next in age after me, was the most adventurous. He climbed the tallest trees and swung from branches, shouting that he was the Tarzan of Montana. I tried to imitate him but was never quite as brave. On Sundays, we went to St. Michael's Church in the center of the settlement. After Mass, families gathered in the churchyard for a community potluck where everyone brought what they could. The women exchanged recipes and remedies, while the men talked about hunting and told stories about mountain lions and grizzly bears. It was at one of these Sunday gatherings that I first saw the man who would change my life forever, Everett Maxwell, a stranger who had recently arrived in our settlement. He wasn't like the other men there. He wore round glasses, spoke with fancy words, and always carried a notebook under his arm. They said he was an important scientist who had come to study the plants of the region. I was only 12 when he appeared in our settlement. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was helping serve the cornbread when our eyes met for the first time. He smiled at me in a way that left me both fascinated and frightened. There was something in his eyes, something cold, calculating, as if he were evaluating me, measuring my worth. "What a strong, healthy girl," he commented to my father, as if I were a plant or animal being studied. "She has good physical development for her age, must have exceptional genetics." Daddy, simple as he was, swelled with pride at the doctor from the big city's compliment. Little did he know those words weren't a compliment, but the beginning of an assessment, like a scientist observing an interesting specimen for his experiments. From that day on, Everett began frequenting our home. He brought small gifts, scented soap for Mama, new fishing hooks for Daddy, candies for us children. He said he was interested in the medicinal herbs Mama prepared and spent hours talking with her, noting everything in his notebook. But I noticed his eyes always following me. When I helped Mama grind the herbs, when I carried water, when I played with my siblings. His cold eyes studied me as if I were a math problem to be solved. Over time, he won the trust of the entire family. Daddy considered him a wise and important man. Mama felt honored that a doctor was interested in her knowledge of plants. My siblings adored him because he brought sweets and told stories of the big city. Only I felt that chill in my stomach whenever he was around. Only I sensed something wrong in the way he looked at all of us, as if we were pieces in a game only he knew the rules to. The day my childhood truly ended was on my 15th birthday. Everett showed up at our house with a special present, an invitation for me to go study in the big city, in Denver. He said he had secured a place for me at a good school, that I could become a nurse or even a doctor if I wanted. "This girl has too much potential to stay buried in this backwater," he told my parents. "Let her come with me. I promise to care for her as if she were my own daughter." My parents, dazzled by the possibility of a better life for me, accepted the proposal. Mama cried as she packed my small bundle of clothes, but was happy because she believed I would have a bright future. That night, lying in bed, I heard Mama and Daddy talking softly. "Did we do the right thing, George?" "Of course we did, woman. Dr. Everett will give our daughter a future. Who knows, maybe one day she'll come back here already educated to help our people. If only they knew. If only they could have imagined that they weren't sending me to a bright future, but to a laboratory of horrors where I would be not a student, but a guinea pig." The last day I saw my parents and siblings was also the last day of my innocence. Because the next day, when I climbed into that car with Everett, I wasn't going to a school in Denver. I was going to hell disguised as a home. The car cut through the Montana landscape as I, having just turned 15, looked one last time at the familiar creeks and mountains fading in the distance. Everett explained that we would make a stop in Salt Lake City before continuing to Denver. He talked about the school where I would study, the subjects I would learn, how different my life would be. His words were sweet, but his eyes remained cold, calculating, like a rattlesnake sizing up its prey. We never reached Denver. After 2 days in Salt Lake City, we boarded another car, smaller, that followed a remote country road. We arrived at an isolated property surrounded by dense forest. A large wooden house with an annex that looked like a small laboratory. It was there that I met the true face of Everett Maxwell. "Welcome to your new home, Edith," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Here you won't just be a student. You'll be part of something much greater, something that will revolutionize science." That same night, he explained that he was a brilliant scientist, misunderstood by the academic community. He had been a professor of experimental psychology at Cornell University, but was expelled because his methods were too advanced for mediocre minds, according to him. They didn't understand that to truly comprehend human behavior, we need real experiments, not just theories, he explained, nervously adjusting his round glasses. But you, Edith, will help me prove that I'm right. In the first few months, he really did teach me many things. Mathematics, science, history. I learned to read and write better, discovered books and ideas I would never have had access to in our settlement. Everett was a strict teacher, but patient. For a brief moment, I began to think that perhaps he really did want to help me. Then, at 16, I met Arthur, a 19-year-old boy who worked on the neighboring property. We met a few times in secret, exchanged glances, shy smiles. One day, Everett caught me talking with him by the creek. He said nothing at the time, but that night, "You've disappointed me, Edith," he said, with that controlled voice that was more frightening than any shout. "I thought you were different, more intelligent, but I see you're just a country girl like any other, thinking about boys instead of taking advantage of the opportunity I've given you." It was the first time he locked me in the basement, a dark, damp room with only a thin mattress on the floor. I stayed there for 3 days, receiving only water and a little cornmeal. When I came out, I swore to myself that I would never look at Arthur or any other boy again. At 17, what I feared most happened. Everett asked me to marry him. It wasn't a request, really, but an announcement. "We'll get married next month," he declared during dinner. "I've already arranged the necessary documents. Your parents have given their blessing by letter." I doubted my parents really knew what was happening, but I had no way to contest it. I was completely isolated, without friends, without family, with no one to turn to. And so, in 1964, I became Mrs. Edith Maxwell, at 17, married to a 42-year-old man. It was after the wedding that the true horror began. Everett no longer bothered maintaining the facade of a benevolent teacher. He showed me his true project, studying the limits of human resistance to trauma inflicted by close people. "Current science only studies trauma after the fact," he explained, with that maniacal gleam in his eyes. "I want to document the process in real time, with control over all variables." At first, the experiments were simple: sleep deprivation, alterations in diet, social isolation. He meticulously noted each of my reactions in his black-covered notebooks. He measured my blood pressure, collected blood samples, recorded my weight, and even the frequency with which I cried. Then I got pregnant. Everett was ecstatic, not as a happy father, but as a scientist who had just received new equipment. "Perfect!" he exclaimed. "Now we can expand the experiment to a second generation. Imagine the possibilities." My first child, Owen, was born in 1965. He was followed by Zelda in 1967, Jeremy in 1969, and little Catherine in 1971. 4 children whom I loved more than anything in the world, but whom Everett saw only as new subjects for his sick experiments. When Owen turned 6, Everett announced the new phase of his scientific project. He gathered the whole family in the living room and explained, with the coldness of someone discussing the weather, that we would begin a study on the human spirit's capacity to endure suffering inflicted by loved ones. "Edith will be the main subject of the experiment," he explained to the children. "You will be the stimulus agents. I will be the observer and document everything for posterity." The children, confused, looked to me for explanation. But what could I say? I myself barely comprehended the horror that was being announced. The next day it began. Everett had transformed one of the rooms into a kind of laboratory. There was a chair in the center, instruments on tables around it, and a corner with a desk where he sat to observe and take notes. "Owen," called Everett, "today you're going to learn how to apply a controlled, painful stimulus to your mother." My son, at 6 years old, looked frightened at his father, then at me. "I don't want to hurt Mommy," he said, his voice trembling. Everett's smile disappeared. "That's not an option, son. It's science. If you refuse, I'll have to apply the stimulus to you to document the difference in reaction between adults and children." That's how it began. My own son, forced to pinch me, pull my hair, give me small shocks with a device Everett had built. Meanwhile, my husband noted everything. How long it took me to cry, how my skin turned red, how my breathing changed. Over time, the stimuli got worse. Everett taught the children different methods of causing pain, always with that clinical language, devoid of emotion. Apply pressure to this point until your mother emits a sound of discomfort. Observe how the skin changes color when you press with enough force. The worst wasn't the physical pain. It was seeing my children being transformed into monsters against their own will. Seeing the terror in their eyes, the despair, the guilt. Everett constantly threatened them. If they refused to participate, they would be punished. If they didn't follow instructions correctly, they would go without food. If they showed too much empathy for me, they would be isolated in the basement. It's for the good of science, he repeated. You are privileged to participate in such an important study. One day, when I publish my results, the world will understand the value of what we did here. The sessions happened 3 times a week, always at the same time. Everett was methodical, obsessive about scientific precision. Sometimes he had all 4 children participate together. Other times, he chose just one, to compare different approaches. Jeremy, my 3rd child, was the one who resisted the most. At 5 years old, he already tried to sabotage the experiments, pretending to be sick or deliberately making mistakes in his father's instructions. Everett noticed and punished him severely, often forcing him to go without eating for days. Zelda, my oldest daughter, developed a different strategy. She became cold, distant, as if switching off her humanity during the sessions. She executed her father's orders with robotic precision, showing no emotion. At night, I heard her crying hidden in her room. Catherine, being the youngest, was the most easily manipulated. Everett convinced her that this was normal, that all families did similar things. She believed she was helping me in some incomprehensible way. Owen, my firstborn, was the most complex. He alternated between periods of revolt and moments of total submission. In some sessions, he cried more than I did. In others, he seemed to almost find some perverse pleasure in the power his father granted him over me. Years passed like this, an endless cycle of clinical horror documented in dozens of black notebooks that Everett kept locked in his office. I tried to escape twice, but he always found me. On the second attempt, as punishment, he increased the intensity of the stimuli and began to include more severe deprivations, days without water, without being able to speak, without being able to move. Fascinating how the human body adapts, he commented, observing my physical and mental deterioration. Your resilience is remarkable, Edith. You're the best study subject I could have found. I was no longer a person in his eyes. I was a set of reactions, statistics, graphs in his notebooks. And my children, my poor children, were becoming smaller versions of him, cold scientists faced with the suffering of others. Until one night in 1977, when I was 30 years old and had been living in that hell for 15 years, I noticed something different in Owen's look. Then 12 years old. A flash of consciousness, of humanity, reclaimed. It was at that moment that I understood. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to save at least one of my children, I would need to do something much more drastic than just try to escape. That night, lying in bed after another experiment session, I made a promise to myself. Everett Maxwell would pay for every second of pain he caused me and my children, and I would use all the patience I had learned in years of suffering to plan my revenge with the same scientific precision that he so valued. The anger didn't arise in me suddenly. It grew slowly, like one of those Montana plants that seem harmless on the surface, but whose roots spread silently until they dominate everything around them. Each experiment session, each cold note in Everett's notebook, each tear from my children added more fuel to this fire that burned within me. In the early years, my anger was chaotic, explosive. I screamed, begged, threatened. I tried to attack Everett once, during his sleep. He woke up, immobilized me with ease, and the next day created a new experiment to measure the subject's aggressiveness when provoked. It was the worst session of all. He made Jeremy, then just 6 years old, hold my arms, while Owen applied shocks of increasing intensity until I passed out. Fascinating. Everett murmured when I regained consciousness. Extreme anger completely altered your pain resistance patterns. It was at that moment that I understood. My uncontrolled anger was just more data for his experiments. He fed on it, studied it, documented it. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to save my children, I would need to transform this anger into something different. Something cold, calculated, patient. Something he couldn't detect and study. From that day on, I began to change. Externally, I became more submissive, more resigned. I stopped openly resisting the experiments. Everett noticed the change and was initially disappointed. He even increased the intensity of the stimuli to provoke more intense reactions. But eventually he accepted that he had reached a new stage of the experiment. The complete breaking of the subject's will. Little did he know that, inside, my will was stronger than ever. While he thought he had broken me, I was merely channeling my anger toward a higher purpose. Each pain, each humiliation was carefully stored in my memory, not to feed blind hatred, but to strengthen my determination. At night, when everyone was asleep, I practiced breathing techniques I had learned from my mother. I focused on emptying my mind, on separating consciousness from physical pain. This allowed me to endure the increasingly severe experiments and, at the same time, observe everything with clarity. Everett's routines, his weaknesses, my children's behavior patterns. I realized that Owen, my firstborn, was at a critical age. At 12 years old, he had participated in the experiments for so long that he risked completely normalizing that sick situation. But I also noticed that, unlike Zelda, who had become emotionally disconnected, or Catherine, who naively believed her father's justifications, Owen still had moments of doubt, of internal conflict, small hesitations before following his father's orders, furtive looks of guilt after the sessions. It was on him that I decided to focus my efforts. If I could reclaim the humanity of at least one of my children, perhaps I would have a chance to escape that hell. I began to establish silent communication with Owen. Small gestures when Everett wasn't looking. A gentle touch on the hand. A meaningful look. A smile of understanding when he showed reluctance to hurt me. On the rare occasions when we were alone, when Everett went out to fetch supplies from the nearest town, I whispered words of affirmation to him. "It's not your fault, son," I would say softly. "Your father is sick. What happens here isn't normal. One day, we'll get out of this place." At first, Owen backed away, frightened, as if my words were a trap. Everett had conditioned us to distrust each other, to see any display of affection as a weakness. But, over time, my persistence began to break through the barrier my son had built around his heart. While working on Owen's emotional recovery, I never stopped looking for an opportunity to escape. For years, I had collected small pieces of information, the exact location of our property, which I discovered by overhearing Everett's conversations with the few merchants who came to us. The times when he went out, the keys he kept, the paths through the forest. But escaping wouldn't be enough. I knew Everett would find us, as he had done before. And even if we managed to disappear, what guarantee did I have that he wouldn't do the same to other people? No, fleeing wasn't the final goal. It was just the first step in a larger plan. The anger inside me had transformed into something more refined, more precise. It was no longer just the desire to escape from suffering, but the determination to ensure that Everett could never do what he did to us to anyone else. And for that, I needed evidence. Irrefutable evidence of the horrors that happened in that house. The notebooks, the damned black notebooks where he methodically documented each experiment, each reaction, each drop of suffering. They were the key, both to Everett's conviction and to his obsession. He kept them locked in his office, checked them compulsively, organized them with almost religious care. In 1978, when Owen turned 13, I felt he was ready, that he had recovered enough of his humanity to help me. During one of the experiment sessions, when Everett asked him to increase the intensity of the shock he was applying to me, I saw the refusal in his eyes. He obeyed, because he had no choice. But at that moment, we established silent communication. A tacit agreement that this needed to end. That night, while Everett slept, Owen came to my room, something he hadn't done since he was very little. "Mom," he whispered, with teary eyes. "What we're doing is wrong, isn't it?" It was as if a dam had broken inside me. Years of contained emotions threatened to overflow, but I managed to maintain my composure. That wasn't the moment to fall apart. It was the moment to act. "Yes, son," I replied, holding his hands. "It's very wrong. Your father, he's not well. What he calls science is actually a sickness, and we need to stop it." In the following weeks, I began to prepare Owen. I explained to him about the world beyond that isolated property, the cities, the laws, the police who could help us. I talked about his siblings and the possibility of saving them too. And most importantly, about the notebooks we needed to obtain as evidence. The opportunity arose when Everett announced he would make a 3-day trip to Denver to buy new equipment. It was the longest window we had ever had. Owen managed to find the key to the office, which Everett kept hidden in a secret compartment of his desk. When we finally opened the office door and saw the shelves full of black notebooks, all meticulously labeled by date, I felt a mixture of horror and validation. There were more than 50 notebooks, documenting 15 years of systematic torture. We leafed through some of them and found detailed clinical descriptions of each session, accompanied by graphs, tables, and even photographs. "He's crazy," Owen murmured, his voice trembling. "Completely crazy." "Yes," I agreed, "and that's why we need to stop him." That night, sitting by candlelight in my room, we elaborated our plan. We couldn't flee with all the notebooks. There were too many, and they would draw attention. We needed to choose the most incriminating ones, those that clearly showed the nature of the experiments and the forced involvement of the children. But as we read more of those horrible records, something in me changed. The cold, calculated anger I had cultivated for years began to warm again. Each page of those notebooks reignited the fury I had worked so hard to control. There was one notebook in particular, labeled Extreme Reactions of Subject A. I was Subject A, that documented the times Everett had taken me beyond the limits of consciousness. Detailed descriptions of how my body reacted to extreme pain, how long it took for me to pass out, how long to regain consciousness. All noted with the precision of someone recording the temperature on a thermometer. At that moment, I knew it wouldn't be enough to just escape and report Everett to the authorities. The anger I had tamed for so long returned with full force, but now it wasn't chaotic as before. It was focused, directed, relentless. "We'll do more than just flee, Owen," I said, closing the notebook. "We'll ensure your father never does this to anyone again." My son looked at me with a mixture of fear and understanding. He was only 13 years old, but the eyes that stared at me were those of someone much older, someone who had seen and done things no child should know. "What are you thinking, Mom?" he asked. I looked at the piles of notebooks, at Everett's meticulous notes, at the torture instruments he called scientific equipment. 15 years of pain, humiliation, lives destroyed in the name of perverted science. "I'm thinking that your father always wanted to understand the limits of human resistance," I replied, with a calmness that surprised even myself. "Maybe it's time we test his limits." The anger had transformed into something beyond hatred. It was crystalline certainty, absolute determination. Everett Maxwell would not only be stopped, he would experience firsthand the fruit of his own methods. And I, whom he considered merely a study subject, would be the scientist responsible for his final experiment. On the eve of Everett's return, as Owen and I finalized preparations for our escape, I couldn't stop thinking about the notebooks, the cold notes, the photographs of my suffering. It wasn't just my pain that moved me. It was the awareness that if we didn't stop him definitively, he would find other victims, create other laboratories. It was then that I knew, with absolute certainty, that my anger would never die until I transformed Everett Maxwell from scientist to guinea pig, until he understood, in his own skin, the true meaning of his experiments on trauma and resilience. In 1978, at 31 years old, I began to meticulously plan what would be not just our escape, but the complete destruction of Everett Maxwell. The 15 years I spent as his guinea pig taught me valuable lessons: patience, detailed observation, and mainly, how to think like him. As I read his experiment notebooks, I realized I could use his own scientific method against him. Everett was obsessive about controlling variables. He created controlled environments for his experiments, isolating each factor to measure its exact consequences. This same obsession would be his downfall. A good experiment, he used to say during his torture sessions, eliminates all unwanted variables and maintains only those we want to study. I spent weeks studying his behavior patterns, his routines, his weaknesses. Everett was a man of rigid habits. He woke at 5:30 every morning, had coffee precisely at 6:15, worked in his office until noon, had lunch at 12:30, conducted experiments from 2 to 4 p.m., and at night reviewed his notes while drinking exactly 2 fingers of whiskey before sleeping at 10 p.m. His predictability would be my first ally. The second would be his pride. Everett had absolute confidence in his intellectual superiority. He believed that no one, especially a country girl without formal education like me, could surpass him in intelligence or planning. The third ally would be his own obsession. The experiment notebooks were his most precious treasure, the proof of his life's work. He checked them compulsively, constantly reorganized them, talked about how one day they would be studied at the greatest universities in the world. With Owen's help, who was now completely on my side, I began to map the property. Our laboratory was approximately 25 miles from the nearest town, Pinewood. The only access route was by car along a private road that Everett kept gated. "We need the most incriminating notebooks," I explained to Owen, "and we need to ensure he can't follow us when we flee." But as our plan developed, I realized it wouldn't be enough to just escape with the evidence. The anger that boiled inside me demanded more. I wanted Everett to feel in his own skin at least a fraction of what he put us through. During his trips to Denver, I began to experiment with the herbs that grew on the property. My mother had taught me about medicinal plants, but also about those that could cause different effects on the human body. I began to discreetly cultivate some of these plants in hidden corners of the land, away from curious eyes. In particular, I found a plant that country folk called sleep root, traditionally used in small doses to treat insomnia, but which in larger quantities caused temporary paralysis, leaving the person conscious but unable to move. It was perfect for what I was planning. Owen noticed my experiments with the plants and became concerned. "Mom, what exactly are you doing?" he asked one afternoon, as I ground leaves in an improvised mortar. "I'm creating a tool, son," I calmly replied. "Just as your father has his tools for experiments, I need mine to ensure our safety." I knew I needed to be careful with Owen. He was willing to help with the escape, to take the notebooks as evidence to the authorities, but I wasn't sure if he would agree with the rest of my plan. So I kept certain parts to myself. Over the months, I refined the sleep root extract until I obtained the exact concentration that would cause the desired effect without fatal risks. I tested small doses on myself to understand precisely how it worked, how long it took to take effect, how long the paralysis lasted. In parallel, I worked with Owen on the logistics of the escape. We determined that the best occasion would be during Everett's next trip to Denver, scheduled for November 1978. He would go to buy new equipment and would be gone for 3 days. "We'll take the small car," I planned with Owen. "Not his main car," he would notice immediately. "The old farm truck is slower, but we can drive it through the back roads where the main car can't go." I carefully calculated the time needed to drive to Pinewood, about 3 hours if we maintained a steady pace. From there, we would catch a bus to Denver, where we would look for the police. But our plans changed drastically when in October 1978, Everett announced an evolution in his experiments. "The time has come to test more extreme limits," he declared during dinner, with that maniacal gleam in his eyes that I knew all too well. "Until now, we've documented Subject A's response to physical and psychological pain at controlled levels. But true science needs to go beyond." He explained, with the coldness of someone discussing the weather, that the next sessions would involve severe stimuli with risk of permanent damage. He showed a new set of instruments he had created, capable of causing more serious injuries. "Naturally," he added, sipping his water, "we'll need control subjects for comparison. Zelda and Jeremy will participate in this phase as secondary guinea pigs." I felt my blood freeze in my veins. It was one thing for him to torture me. I had learned to endure, to survive. It was completely different for him to expand the experiments to include my other children, not just as stimulus applicators, but as direct victims. That night, after everyone went to sleep, Owen came to my room, pale and trembling. "Mom, he's really going to hurt Zelda and Jeremy," he whispered. "We have to do something now. We can't wait until November." He was right. Our timeline needed to be accelerated. But the urgency also meant more risks, less preparation, and mainly, less chance to execute the part of the plan I kept secret. My personal revenge against Everett. In the following days, I refined the final details of the plan. I selected the most incriminating notebooks, those that documented most clearly the nature of the experiments and the forced involvement of the children. Owen managed to hide a small waterproof bag near the road with some basic supplies for the journey. The hardest part was deciding about Zelda, Jeremy, and Catherine. Ideally, we would take them all with us. But Zelda, at 11 years old, had become almost an extension of Everett. She followed his orders without question, had internalized his distorted vision of science. Jeremy, at 9 years old, alternated between periods of open revolt and terrified submission. And Catherine, at only 7 years old, hardly knew another way of life beyond that laboratory of horrors. "We can't risk telling them," I explained to Owen. "Zelda might warn your father, and the younger ones might let something slip unintentionally." The decision to leave just the two of us, with the promise to return to rescue the others as soon as the authorities were alerted, was the most painful I ever made. But I knew it was our best chance. However, there was something more that I didn't share with Owen, something I planned for the night before our escape. In the previous weeks, I had prepared a sufficient quantity of sleeproot extract. The plan was simple. On the night before we left, I would put the extract in the whiskey Everett drank before bed. When he was paralyzed, conscious but unable to move or speak, I would take him to the laboratory. There, I would tie him to the same chair where he tortured me for years. And then, with the same scientific coldness that he so valued, I would conduct my own experiment. I would use his own instruments, his own methods. I would document each reaction, each drop of sweat, each change in breathing. I wanted him to understand, firsthand, what it meant to be reduced to a study subject. I didn't plan to kill him. That would be too merciful. I wanted to leave him alive, but marked just as he marked me. I wanted him to spend the rest of his life in a prison, remembering the moment when the roles were reversed, when the guinea pig became the scientist. I mentally rehearsed each step of this plan. I imagined myself speaking with the same clinical voice he used. "Now we'll document Subject B's response to painful stimulus applied to Region X. Observe how the skin changes color, how the breathing becomes irregular." On the eve of the day we had chosen to flee, I made the final preparations. I checked the bag with the selected notebooks, the supplies hidden near the road, the state of the truck that would determine our escape route, and of course, the bottle with the sleeproot extract, carefully hidden in a secret pocket of my dress. As I prepared dinner that night, I observed Everett in his office, organizing his precious notebooks, completely oblivious to what awaited him. He believed he had absolute control over our lives, over our bodies, over our minds. It never occurred to him that I might be planning something beyond submission. I put the last utensils on the table, called the children for dinner, and mentally revisited every detail of my plan. In a few hours, the roles would be reversed. In a few hours, Everett Maxwell would discover the true meaning of his own science. In a few hours, 15 years of contained anger would find its perfect expression. It was October 17th, 1978, a typical chilly night in Montana. The clock marked 9:43 p.m. when I put 3 drops of sleeproot extract in Everett's whiskey. I observed from afar as he, following his immutable routine, sat at his desk to review his notes for the day. As always, he took the first sip distractedly, without taking his eyes off the notebooks. At 31 years old, after 15 years of torture, I was finally about to turn the tables. "Mom," whispered Owen behind me in the dark hallway. "Everything's ready. The bag with the notebooks is hidden near the road, and I checked the truck. We should leave when he falls asleep, right?" I nodded without taking my eyes off Everett. Owen didn't know about the first part of my plan, For him, we would just wait for the scientist to sleep to silently flee with the evidence. What I planned for the next few hours would remain just between me and my torturer. Go to your room now, I instructed Owen. Pretend you're sleeping. I'll come get you when it's time. As my son walked away, I continued observing Everett. Gradually, I noticed the first signs. He blinked several times, as if trying to clear his vision. His right hand, which held the pen, began to tremble slightly. He frowned, confused by the sudden lack of coordination. Then, he tried to stand up. That's when he realized something was wrong. His legs gave way, and he fell back into the chair, knocking over the glass of whiskey. His wide eyes reflected the growing understanding that he was losing control of his own body. I emerged from my hiding place and calmly entered the office. Everett saw me and tried to speak, but his tongue was already too heavy. Only inarticulate sounds came from his mouth. The sleep route is already taking effect, I explained, with the same clinical voice he used during experiments. It's fascinating, isn't it? You are completely conscious, can feel everything, hear everything, but can't move or speak. Exactly how I felt so many times, tied to that chair in your laboratory. The panic in his eyes was palpable. He tried to scream, but produced only a muffled groan. His body slipped from the chair to the floor, completely paralyzed, while his mind remained terrifyingly lucid. Don't worry, I continued, kneeling beside him. I calculated the dosage carefully. You won't die. That would be unscientific, wouldn't it? What we need is complete data about your experience. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I dragged Everett down the hallway to the room he called the laboratory. I positioned him in the central chair, the same one where I had been tortured countless times, and tied his arms and legs with the leather straps he himself had installed. I turned on the clinical lights, adjusted the recorder he used to register his observations, and began organizing the instruments on the side table. The sleep route didn't affect the ability to feel pain, it only prevented movement and speech. His eyes followed me frantically, silently begging. You always said science requires sacrifices, I commented, selecting one of the instruments he had created specifically to cause pain without leaving permanent marks. Today, you'll finally have the opportunity to personally contribute to your research. I positioned myself in front of him, exactly as he did with me, and began speaking into the recorder. Subject B, male, 56 years old, experiment on role reversal and empathetic understanding of pain. The objective is to determine if an individual who systematically inflicted suffering on others is capable of developing empathy when subjected to the same conditions. I saw the terror grow in Everett's eyes when he recognized his own words, his own methodology, being used against him. I took the first instrument, a small device that applied gradual pressure to finger joints. It was one of his favorites for the initial sessions, as he called them, because it caused intense pain without leaving visible marks. Applying the first stimulus to subject B, I narrated for the recorder. Observing the initial physiological response, as I applied the device to Everett's index finger, I saw the same reactions he documented in me. Pupil dilation, instant sweating, accelerated breathing. Although he couldn't scream, involuntary tears ran down his face. Fascinating, I commented, using his characteristic expression. The subject demonstrates intensified response even to low-intensity stimuli. This suggests low pain tolerance, possibly due to lack of previous experience as a stimulus recipient. For a full hour, I conducted my experiment, narrating each procedure, each reaction, each observation, exactly as he did. I used only the instruments I knew wouldn't cause permanent damage. I didn't want to mutilate or kill him. I wanted him to live, to face man's justice, to spend decades in a prison reflecting on this night. Throughout the process, I maintained constant eye contact with him. I wanted him to know exactly who was in control now. I wanted him to see in my eyes not just anger, but a cold and calculating determination, the same he demonstrated during his experiments. When I finished, I turned off the recorder and leaned close to his ear. 15 years, I whispered. 15 years you tortured me. 15 years you forced my children to participate in your experiments. 15 years you documented our suffering as if we were lab rats. I picked up one of the notebooks I had separated, the most recent, where he detailed his plans for the severe stimuli with risk of permanent damage he intended to apply to Zelda and Jeremy. This ends today, I continued. Not just for me and Owen, who are leaving, but for everyone. Your precious notebooks, your great contribution to science, will be handed over to the authorities. And this recorder, with the record of your first and last experiment as a guinea pig, will be the cherry on top. I put the recorder in the bag where I had already placed the selected notebooks. Then, I took a syringe I had prepared with a second dose of sleep root extract. This will keep you paralyzed for another 12 hours, I explained, injecting the liquid into his arm. Enough time for us to be far away from here when you regain movement. Everett's eyes begged, I don't know if for mercy or for a more complete explanation. I decided to give him what he always denied me, the unfiltered truth. You believed you were creating a scientific masterpiece, but all you did was meticulously document your own crimes, I said, putting away the empty syringe. Each note, each record, each photograph you took thinking you were proving your theories will be used to condemn you. The irony is almost scientific, don't you think? I stood up and arranged the instruments exactly as he did after each session. I cleaned them carefully, placed them in order by size on the metal tray. Everett watched me, motionless except for his eyes that followed my every movement. Oh, I almost forgot, I said, taking his notebook and a pen. I opened it to a blank page and wrote with handwriting as similar as possible to his. Final experiment, when the researcher becomes the researched. Conclusion. Pain is more revealing when experienced than when observed. I placed the open notebook on his chest. A small souvenir for when you wake up, something to reflect on during the next years in prison. I left the laboratory and went straight to Owen's room. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, with wide eyes of anxiety. It's time, I whispered. Take only the essentials. We have a long way ahead. And Dad? He asked, his voice trembling. He drank more than usual today, I lied. He's in a deep sleep. He won't wake up until tomorrow. Owen nodded, relieved. He was just a 13-year-old child who, despite everything he had been through, still couldn't conceive the idea of completely abandoning his father. I would spare him that burden. What happened in that laboratory would remain between me and Everett. Before we left, I stopped at the door of my other children's rooms. Zelda slept curled up, as if even in dreams she was protecting herself. Jeremy was sprawled on the bed, snoring softly. And Catherine, my little one, hugged the small cloth doll I had made for her. We'll come back for you, I silently promised. Sooner than you imagine. Owen and I silently left the house. The night was clear, with millions of stars shining over the Montana forest. We retrieved the bag with the notebooks and the recorder I had hidden near the road and boarded the small farm truck. Drive as quietly as possible until we're far enough away, I instructed Owen. By dawn, we'll be close to Pinewood. As we drove along the dark roads, I looked back one last time. The laboratory house was silent, with only one light on, the one in the office where Everett had begun his night, without imagining how it would end. I felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief for finally escaping, pain for leaving 3 children behind, and a somber satisfaction for having, finally, reversed roles with my torturer. The following hours were of concentrated silence, both driving with all the strength we had, following the road I had studied so many times in my mind. The sky began to lighten when we sighted the first houses of Pinewood. We made it, Mom, whispered Owen, with tears in his eyes. Yes, son, I replied. But this is just the beginning. We parked at a small gas station and went directly to the local sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Walker, a middle-aged man, received us with initial suspicion that soon transformed into horror as we began to tell our story. Ma'am, these are very serious accusations, he said, leafing through one of the notebooks we had brought. His face paled with each page. This is the complete documentation of the experiments my husband conducted on me and forced my children to participate in, I completed. And there's more. Much more. I placed the recorder on the table and pressed the play button. Everett's voice filled the room, coldly detailing one of the cruelest experiments. The sheriff turned off the device after a few minutes, visibly disturbed. And your other children are still there with him? Yes, I replied. That's why we need to act quickly. In the following hours, the small Pinewood Sheriff's Office transformed into the center of a police operation. Reinforcements were called from Denver, statements were taken, and a team was organized to rescue my other children and arrest Everett. Owen and I were taken to a small local clinic for examinations. The doctor, a young recent graduate, couldn't hide his shock at seeing the scars on my body, physical marks of years of experiments. "I've never seen anything like this," he murmured, documenting each mark for the police report. By nightfall, we received the news. The police had arrived at the property, found Everett still tied to the laboratory chair, and rescued the 3 children. They were all on their way to Pinewood. When I finally saw them entering the sheriff's office, I couldn't contain my tears. Zelda, Jeremy, and Catherine seemed confused, frightened, but unharmed. They ran into my arms, even Zelda, who in recent years had become so distant and cold. "He said you had abandoned us," sobbed Zelda, "that you didn't want to be part of the family anymore." "Never," I replied, hugging them tightly. "We left to seek help, to end that nightmare once and for all." Over my children's heads, I saw when 2 police officers brought in a handcuffed Everett. He seemed smaller somehow, without his white coat and authoritative posture. Our gazes met, and I saw something I had never seen before in his eyes: fear, genuine fear of me, the woman he thought he had completely broken, but who ended up being his downfall. "That man," began Sheriff Walker, approaching us. "He's not a man," I interrupted. "He's a monster disguised as a scientist, and now the whole world will know it." In the following weeks, the case gained national repercussion. Journalists from all over America came to Denver, where we were staying under police protection, to hear the story of the Montana Laboratory of Horrors, as it was called by the press. Everett's notebooks were examined by specialists who confirmed the authenticity of the records. The recordings, both those made by him over years and the one I made on the night of the escape, were attached to the case. The medical reports documenting the marks on my body and the psychological trauma in all of us completed the macabre puzzle. Everett was indicted for torture, false imprisonment, mistreatment, psychological abuse, and a list of other crimes. He initially denied everything, claiming it was legitimate scientific research with the participants' consent. But the notebooks, written in his own handwriting, told a different story. The trial took place in Denver 6 months after our escape. I was there, sitting in the front row, when the sentence was read: 30 years in prison without possibility of parole. I didn't smile, didn't celebrate. I just observed as he was taken out of the courtroom, now officially recognized as the monster he always was. That night, staying with my children in a small inn in Denver, I looked out the window at the Rocky Mountains and felt, for the first time in 15 years, that I could breathe freely. Justice had been done, not just by the law of men, but also by my own hands, on that night in the laboratory when I reversed roles with my torturer. Everett Maxwell, the man who believed he could reduce human beings to mere data in his notebooks, was now just a number in the prison system. And I, the guinea pig he thought he had completely broken, was responsible for his fall. After the trial, in 1979, we began a completely new life. With the money from the sale of Everett's property, which came to us after the divorce, and a small indemnity from the state, we moved to Parentons, Montana. I chose this town because it was far enough from our painful memories, but still within the Montana region that, despite everything, was our home. We bought a simple wooden house painted light blue with a view of the creek. In the first few months, we all slept in the same room. The 5 of us piled on mattresses on the floor, unable to bear separation, even if just by a wall. The fear that Everett would somehow escape and find us haunted our dreams. But gradually, with the certainty that he was securely locked in a maximum security prison in Denver, we began to relax. The children were enrolled in the local school, for the first time in their lives for the younger ones. I found work as an assistant at the town pharmacy, where my knowledge of medicinal herbs was valued. The most surprising transformation was in my sleep. For 15 years under Everett's domain, I could barely close my eyes without being assaulted by nightmares. I would wake up screaming in a cold sweat, reliving the experiment sessions. But after that night in October 1978, when I finally delivered justice with my own hands, The nightmares gradually diminished until they disappeared completely. "You're sleeping better, Mom," observed Owen, about a year after our move. He himself still had occasional nightmares, but was improving. "Yes, son," I replied, "because now I know he's experiencing the same fear he made us feel. Justice brings peace." Our new life in Pinewood was simple, but dignified. I planted a small garden behind the house where I cultivated the medicinal herbs I had learned from my mother. People from town began to seek me out for small health problems. An infusion for stomach pain, a tea for insomnia, a poultice for wounds. "The herb lady," they called me with respect. No one there knew about our past. For them, we were just a family from elsewhere looking to start over. And that was exactly what we needed. Anonymity, normality, a space to heal our wounds without the weight of the notoriety the case had brought. Years passed. The children grew up. Owen, who had been my accomplice in the escape, graduated as a teacher and began teaching at the local school. Zelda, who for so long was the most affected by her father's manipulation, found peace working as a nurse. Jeremy became a forest ranger, spending long days in the wilderness. Perhaps nature helped wash away the memories. And Catherine, my little one, followed in my footsteps, learning about medicinal plants and eventually opening her own natural products store. In 1985, I received a letter from the lawyer who had handled our case. Everett had died in prison, not violently, but from a degenerative disease that gradually paralyzed him. I found myself wondering if, in his final days, immobile in an infirmary bed, he remembered that night when he experienced the same impotence he had imposed on me for so many years. I felt no joy at the news of his death, but no grief either. Just a sense of closure, like closing the last page of a dark book. I didn't immediately tell the children. Each of them dealt with the memory of their father in their own way, and I didn't want to reopen healed wounds. It was Owen who finally asked, about 2 months later, "Mom, do you think we'll ever receive news of him?" We were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset over the creek. I looked at my son, now a 20-year-old man, and decided he deserved to know the truth. "We already have, son. He died 2 months ago." Owen was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Then finally he spoke. "You know, Mom, sometimes I wonder what really happened that night, when we escaped." I felt my heart race. "What do you mean?" "You said he was drunk, sleeping, but when the police found him, he was tied to the laboratory chair. How did he get there?" We had never talked about this. In the confusion of subsequent events, the rescue of the other children, the trial, the move to Pinewood, this question had never been directly asked. I looked into my son's eyes and saw that he knew, or at least suspected, that there was more to the story than I had told. He was too intelligent not to have noticed the inconsistencies. "There are things a mother does to protect her children," I finally replied. "Things that are better not spoken aloud." Owen nodded slowly. "He deserved it, whatever happened." "Yes," I agreed. "He deserved every second." That night, lying in my comfortable bed in the blue house in Pinewood, I reflected on the journey that had brought me there. From the innocent girl from Yellowstone to the guinea pig in a laboratory of horrors, and finally to the woman who took her destiny into her own hands. I didn't regret anything I had done that October night. Justice, sometimes, needs to come from the hands of those who were wronged. Over the years, I built a new identity. Miss Edith, the healer of Pinewood, respected for her knowledge of forest plants. My hair turned gray, lines formed around my eyes, but inside, there was a strength no one could take from me. The strength of someone who faced the worst kind of monster and emerged victorious. My children formed their own families. Grandchildren arrived, bringing the joy I thought I would never experience again. At family gatherings, when we were all gathered around the table, I looked at those smiling faces and thought about how much we had overcome. None of them knew exactly what happened that night when I reversed roles with Everett. It was a secret I would take to my grave. As I aged, people saw me only as a sweet and gentle grandmother, an expert in teas and natural remedies. No one would suspect that these same hands that now prepared healing infusions had once delivered an unforgettable lesson to a torturer. That this calm and comforting voice had once coldly narrated a revenge experiment. In 1998, at 51 years old, I received an unexpected letter. It was from the warden of the prison where Everett had served his sentence until death. During a reorganization of the archives, they found a letter he had written shortly before dying, addressed to me. For days, the letter sat on my table, untouched. I didn't know if I wanted to read his last words. What could he say that would change anything? That would justify years of torture? That would erase the horror he imposed on me and our children? Finally, on a quiet night, I opened the yellowed envelope. "Edith," the letter began, with the trembling handwriting of someone already affected by disease. "When you read this, I will already be dead. The disease consuming me is relentless. A progressive paralysis that started in my legs and now reaches my lungs. The doctors say it's coincidence, but I know it's poetic justice." The letter continued, not with requests for forgiveness or justifications, but with a surprising confession. That night in the laboratory was my first moment of true clarity. For the first time, I understood what I had done to you, to the children, to us. I felt what you felt. I saw in your eyes what you must have seen in mine for so many years. It was illuminating. He went on, describing how the years in prison and the disease slowly consuming him had given him time to reflect, how he finally understood the monstrosity of his actions. "I don't ask for your forgiveness. It would be a final insult after everything I did. I just want you to know that you achieved what you wanted that night. You not only punished me, but made me understand. And that understanding has been my true prison since then." The letter ended with a line that made my heart stop for an instant. "Your final experiment was the only one that produced valid scientific results. Pain truly is more revealing when experienced than when observed." He had read what I wrote in his notebook that night, and apparently had understood the lesson. I burned the letter that same night. There was no reason to keep his words, to give him any space in my current life. But somehow, knowing that he had understood, that my act of revenge had penetrated his distorted mind and brought clarity, brought a final satisfaction I hadn't expected to feel. In the years that followed, I continued my peaceful life in Pinewood. The herb lady became the herb grandma as white hair completely dominated my head. My grandchildren grew up hearing stories about Montana plants and Native American legends, never about laboratories of horror or cruel experiments. That past was buried as deeply as Everett. The peace I found didn't come from forgiveness. I never forgave Everett and never felt the need to do so. It came from the certainty that justice had been done, by my own hands and by the laws of men, that my children were safe, healed as much as possible from the scars they carried, and that I had survived, not just as a victim, but as the architect of my torturer's downfall. When people asked me how I managed to be so serene, so at peace with myself, despite advanced age and life's difficulties, I would just smile and say, "I learned long ago that we reap what we sow, and when we plant justice, we harvest peace." What they didn't know was that justice sometimes needs to be planted with one's own hands, and that the peace I enjoyed came not just from having escaped hell, but from having ensured that the demon who created that hell experienced, if only for one night, the fire he ignited. Well, my dears, who have followed my story to this point, many years have passed since those dark days. Today, at 78 years old, sitting on the porch of my little blue house in Pinewood, I see the creek follow its eternal course and think about how life is also like that, always moving forward, regardless of the obstacles it finds along the way. You who have heard me tell this story might be wondering why, after so long, I decided to share these intimate and painful moments of my life. The answer is simple. Because there are women, men, and children who are, at this very moment, trapped in their own laboratories of horror. People who suffer silently, who see no way out, who believe their fate is sealed by the hand of a torturer. To these people, I want to say, the cage door isn't always as locked as it seems. Sometimes the key is right in front of us, disguised as courage, determination, or even anger. A cold, calculated anger that can be transformed into action. Sometimes, my dears, justice doesn't come from the state or from God. Sometimes we have to make it ourselves. I'm not here to say what's right or wrong in the eyes of the law or religion. I'm here to tell my truth. that when the system fails, when there's no one to turn to, when we're cornered in a monster's laboratory, it is our right, perhaps even our duty, to seek justice with our own hands. For women who suffer in silence, who carry invisible marks of daily abuse, who have their souls slowly crushed by men who think they own their bodies and minds, you are stronger than you think. The oppressor only has power as long as we believe in his power. The moment we decide we're no longer going to accept, no longer going to tremble, no longer going to bow, at that moment, we begin to dismantle the laboratory that imprisons us. I never regretted what I did that night in October 1978. I never had a single sleepless night wondering if I had done the right thing, because I knew, deep in my heart, that some people need to pay for what they do, that some acts are so monstrous they demand a response in kind, that some predators only understand when they experience the same fear they impose on others. Everett Maxwell died knowing exactly what he had done. He died with the clear understanding that the guinea pig he thought he had broken was the architect of his ruin. He died paralyzed by a disease that mimicked the effect of the sleep route I used on him, unable to move, but fully conscious. Justice takes many forms, my dears, and sometimes it comes disguised as coincidence. Today, I look at my children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren, and I see it was worth it. Worth every drop of sweat, every tear, every moment of fear during the escape, every night planning revenge, because they are alive, free, and, as much as possible, healed. Because I broke the cycle of abuse that could have continued for generations. If you know someone who hurt a child, a woman, an innocent person, remember my story. Remember that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom, from a police station, from a judge in a robe. Sometimes, justice comes from the calloused hands of a woman who decided enough was enough, who decided to transform 15 years of pain into a single night of role reversal, who decided her torturer needed to understand in his own skin the true meaning of his experiments. Share this video so more people know that justice can come in unexpected ways. And if you've made it this far, write in the comments, "Justice was served." That shows me who really understood my message. I'm not ashamed to say I delivered justice with my own hands. I'm not ashamed to admit I saw terror in Everett's eyes that night and felt satisfaction. I'm not ashamed to confess that, when I learned of his death by progressive paralysis, I thought, life's sleep route finally caught up with him. Because, my dears, what he never knew is that on that night, when I applied to him the same instruments he used on me for years, I wasn't just seeking revenge. I was closing a chapter. I was ensuring that even if he escaped prison one day, he would never have the courage to approach me or my children again. The fear I planted in him that night, the fear of me, the guinea pig who became scientist, was so deep that he carried it to his grave. And me? I sleep like an angel every night since then, because I know I did what had to be done, because I know my children are safe, because I know Everett Maxwell, wherever he is, still remembers the night when the guinea pig turned the tables. Justice, my dears, sometimes has the face of an ordinary woman, with hands calloused from working hard, with eyes that have seen hell, and with the determination of someone who has nothing more to lose. Justice sometimes is ourselves, and if that makes me a criminal in the eyes of some, so be it. I'd rather be a living criminal with healthy children and a clear conscience than a perfect victim dead in a laboratory of horrors in Montana. Life taught me that liberating justice rarely comes without a price. I paid mine. Everett paid his. And here I am, decades later, sharing my story so other people find the courage to break their own chains, whatever way necessary. In the end, everyone knows the pain they carry. Everyone knows the limit of what they can endure. And everyone needs to decide for themselves when the time has come to say, enough. Today, justice will be done by my hands. Thank you for listening, my dears. May my words find those who need them. Don't forget to subscribe to Grandparents' Tales and like this video if it moved you. Comment below where you're watching from. I love connecting with all of you who have become part of our growing community. And may justice, in one form or another, reach all those who cause suffering to the innocent. Because in the end, as we say here in Montana, not every rattlesnake dies from a gunshot. Some die strangled by their own body when they try to swallow prey larger than they can digest. Everett tried to swallow me, and he choked on his own evil.